1887 family photo resurfaces, and experts freeze when they notice the shadow behind the child. The humidity hung thick in the air as Daniel Rivers unlocked the back door of the Charleston Historical Archives on a sweltering August morning. At 34, he'd worked as the head archivist for 6 years, and he'd grown accustomed to the routine, cataloging donations, preserving documents, and answering research requests from genealogists and historians. But today felt different. On his desk sat a package that had arrived the day before, just as he was leaving. No return address, no donation form, just a plain brown box wrapped in tape with a handwritten label, Charleston Historical Archives. Attention, archivist. Daniel made himself coffee before carefully opening the package. Inside, wrapped in bubble wrap and tissue paper, was a photograph in an ornate wooden frame. The frame itself was remarkable and dark walnut with intricate carvings along the edges, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of wealth and status in the late 19th century. He lifted the photograph into the light streaming through his office window. The image showed a family of 5 posed in what appeared to be a well-appointed parlor. The father stood on the left, his hand resting on the back of an upholstered chair, wearing a dark suit with a high collar and watch chain visible across his vest. The mother sat in the chair, her posture rigid and formal, wearing an elaborate dark dress with a high neckline and her hair swept up in the fashion of the 1880s. 3 children completed the scene. 2 older girls, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, stood beside their mother in matching white dresses with dark sashes. The youngest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, sat on a small stool in the foreground, his legs dangling, his hands folded in his lap. The photograph had the sepia tone and formal composition typical of the 1880s. The family stared solemnly at the camera. Smiling was rare in photographs from that era due to long exposure times. Behind them, Daniel could see details of their home. Wallpaper with a floral pattern, a marble fireplace mantel, heavy curtains framing a window, and wooden wainscoting along the walls. Daniel turned the frame over. On the back, written in faded ink on a small label, were the words, "The Hartwell Family, Charleston, South Carolina, September 1887. He set the photograph on his desk and stared at it. The name was familiar. He'd seen it in property records and social registers. Something about the photograph held his attention, a subtle wrongness that nagged at him. The youngest child's eyes were wide, his expression less solemn and more genuinely frightened. Daniel decided to scan the photograph. Daniel carefully removed the photograph from its frame, noting the original backing and photographer's stamp. Whitfield & Associates, Fine Portraiture, Charleston, SC. He placed it on the archive's high-resolution scanner, equipment that had proven invaluable for preservation work. The scanner hummed as it captured the image in extraordinary detail. Daniel uploaded the file to his computer and opened it in imaging software. At full resolution, every thread of fabric, every strand of hair, every grain of wallpaper pattern was visible. He zoomed in on each family member's face. The father, perhaps in his early 40s, had deep-set eyes and a guarded expression. The mother looked younger, with delicate features and hands that gripped the chair arms with noticeable tension. The older girls looked composed, almost unnaturally so. But the youngest child, the boy, showed unmistakable fear. His small hands clutched his knees, and his eyes seemed fixed on something beyond the camera. Daniel examined the room itself more closely. The wallpaper was expensive damask. The fireplace mantel held a clock and decorative vases. The curtains were heavy velvet, drawn back to allow light. Then Daniel noticed something odd. On the wall behind the young boy, partially hidden by the edge of the velvet curtain, there appeared to be a mark carved into the wooden wainscoting. He increased the magnification, adjusting the contrast and brightness. His breath caught. It was a symbol, deliberately carved into the wood. Even partially obscured, the design was clear, a circle with lines radiating outward and intersecting in a specific pattern, with what looked like additional markings incorporated into the center. Daniel's heart began to race. He recognized this from his graduate studies in folklore. It was a witch mark, also called an apotropaic mark, a protective symbol that people carved into their homes to ward off evil and protect against curses. But this photograph was from 1887. By that time, such practices were considered primitive superstition, especially among educated, wealthy urban families like the Hartwells appeared to be. Witch marks belonged to earlier centuries and were associated with rural, less educated populations. Why would a prosperous Charleston family in 1887 have carved a protective symbol into the wall of their formal parlor? And why would they allow it to be visible, even partially, in their family portrait? Daniel saved the enhanced image and leaned back. Something had frightened this family badly enough to make them abandon social propriety and embrace what would have been seen as backward superstition. He needed to find out what had happened to the Hartwells and why they felt they needed protection from evil. Daniel spent the rest of the day immersed in research. The Charleston Historical Society's archives contained extensive records of prominent families, and the Hartwell name appeared frequently in documents from the 1870s and 1880s. He started with city directories. In 1885, Edmund Hartwell was listed as a merchant and importer, with business offices on East Bay Street and a residence on Meeting Street, one of Charleston's most prestigious addresses. His wife was Catherine, and they had 3 children: Amelia, born 1877, Eleanor, born 1879, and William, born 1883. William. That would be the frightened little boy in the photograph. He would have been 4 years old in September 1887. Daniel pulled property records for the Meeting Street address. The Hartwells had purchased the house in 1876. It was a large 3-story home with formal gardens and servant quarters. Property tax records showed Edmund Hartwell was wealthy. His assets included the home, the business, and several rental properties. Everything pointed to a successful, respectable family. So, what had gone wrong? Daniel turned to newspaper archives, searching for any mention of the Hartwell family between 1885 and 1890. For a while, he found only social notices, attendance at balls, church events, Edmund's business dealings. But then in the Charleston News and Courier from April 1885, he found something that made him pause. It was a small article, barely 2 inches of text. Tragic accident claims young life. Master George Hartwell, age 7, son of Mr. Edmund Hartwell, prominent merchant of this city, died on Tuesday last following a grievous accident at the family residence on Meeting Street. The child fell from an upper-story window and succumbed to his injuries despite the attentions of Dr. James Morrison. The family requests privacy during this time of mourning. Daniel read the article 3 times. George Hartwell, a 7-year-old boy who died in a fall from a window in April 1885, 2.5 years before the family photograph was taken. He checked his earlier notes. The city directory from 1885 had listed only 3 children. George wasn't mentioned, which made sense. The directory was compiled before his death. Daniel searched for more information but found nothing beyond the initial article. No inquest, no follow-up stories. In the 19th century, childhood deaths were tragically common. But something about the brief article bothered him. The phrasing was oddly formal, almost evasive. Grievous accident seemed like careful language, the kind used when there were details the family didn't want publicized. Daniel needed to find out more about George's death and what happened to the family afterward. Daniel discovered that after George's death, the Hartwell family's presence in Charleston social circles had diminished noticeably. The society pages that had regularly mentioned Catherine Hartwell's attendance at various events went silent after April 1885. Edmund's business continued, but the family seemed to retreat from public life. Then, in October 1886, 18 months after George's death and almost a year before the family photograph, Daniel found a cryptic letter to the editor in the Charleston News and Courier. It was signed only "A Concerned Citizen." It is the duty of our community to stand vigilant against those who would bring harm to the innocent through negligence or darker means. When tragedy strikes in a household, one must ask whether divine providence alone is responsible, or whether human agency plays a role. The authorities should investigate circumstances that reasonable people find suspicious. The letter was vague, but Daniel's instincts told him it was connected to the Hartwells. He searched for official investigations but found nothing in public records. However, he did find a response letter published a week later, signed "A Friend of Justice." Those who cast aspersions on grieving families without evidence engage in the lowest form of slander. Accidents are tragedies, not crimes, and those who suggest otherwise reveal more about their own character. The Hartwell family has suffered enough without enduring the poison of malicious gossip. Daniel sat back, his mind racing. Someone had publicly suggested that George Hartwell's death was suspicious. Someone else had defended the family. This wasn't just gossip. This was a public accusation, however veiled. He went to the archives basement and pulled boxes containing coroner's records from the 1880s. The records were incomplete, but he finally found what he was looking for: a brief coroner's report from April 1885. George Hartwell, male, age 7, cause of death: injuries sustained in fall from 3rd-story window. Examination revealed broken neck and severe head trauma consistent with such a fall. Death ruled accidental. no evidence of foul play. The report was perfunctory, exactly what Daniel would expect. But there was a handwritten notation at the bottom, in different ink. Family disputed circumstances. Investigation declined due to insufficient evidence. Family disputed circumstances. The Hartwells themselves had questioned whether George's death was truly an accident, but the authorities had declined to investigate further. Daniel's phone buzzed. An email from Dr. Rebecca Thornton, a folklore specialist he'd contacted about the witch mark. "Daniel, that's definitely an apotropaic mark. Very unusual to see in 1887. If they carved this, they believed someone was actively trying to harm them. This wasn't superstition, this was targeted protection. Look for a specific enemy." Daniel knew what he needed to do next. Daniel returned to the newspaper archives, searching more broadly for stories involving children, accidents, or suspicious deaths in Charleston during the 1880s. He also pulled property records for the Meeting Street area, identifying who lived near the Hartwell family. The house directly adjacent to the Hartwells belonged to a man named Nathaniel Grayson. Daniel found Grayson's name repeatedly in city records. He was a cotton broker, quite successful, with extensive business connections. He'd moved to Charleston in 1880 with his wife, Virginia. They had no children. What struck Daniel was how often Grayson's name appeared in legal documents. He'd been involved in multiple lawsuits, property disputes, contract disagreements, allegations of fraud. Several cases had been settled out of court. In one instance, in 1883, a former business partner had accused Grayson of deliberately sabotaging a shipment, causing financial ruin. Daniel found character references from one of these cases. Several people had testified that Grayson was vindictive, that he held grudges, and that he was known to retaliate against anyone he believed had wronged him. Then, Daniel found something that made his pulse quicken. In March 1885, 1 month before George Hartwell's death, Edmund Hartwell had testified as a witness in a civil case against Nathaniel Grayson. A merchant named Thomas Crawford had sued Grayson for breach of contract, and Edmund had provided testimony supporting Crawford's claims, stating that he'd personally witnessed Grayson making false representations. Grayson had lost the case and been ordered to pay substantial damages. According to court records, he'd been furious and had made a statement that, "Those who conspire against me will learn the cost of their betrayal." 1 month later, George Hartwell was dead. Daniel sat motionless, staring at his screen. Could this be coincidence? A child falls from a window shortly after his father testified against a vengeful neighbor? He searched for any connection between Grayson and the anonymous letters to the newspaper. The timing was right. The accusations against the Hartwell family began in 1886, more than a year after George's death. It would have been a calculated campaign, whispers and insinuations designed to isolate the family socially. Daniel needed more evidence. He searched for any materials related to the Hartwell family in the Society's collection of private papers. He found nothing under Edmund or Catherine's names, but when he searched for the children, he discovered something unexpected, a small collection donated in 1965 by a woman named Eleanor Hartwell Morrison. Eleanor, one of the daughters in the photograph. The collection arrived in a single archival box, a few photographs, some letters, a Bible, and a small leather journal. Daniel opened it carefully. The first entry was dated January 1920. "I am now 41 years old, and I have decided to write down what I remember." Daniel read Eleanor's journal with growing horror and fascination. Her words, written more than 3 decades after the events, painted a picture of a family under siege. "George was the kindest of us all," Eleanor had written. "He was 7 years old, full of energy and curiosity. Our father doted on him. George was his only son. Our neighbor, Mr. Grayson, lived in the large house next to ours. Mother always said there was something cold about him. Father had business dealings with him initially, but they had a falling out. When Father testified against Mr. Grayson in court in March of 1885, everything changed. Mr. Grayson would stand at his fence and stare at our house for hours. He never spoke to us, just stood there watching. It frightened Mother terribly. George was afraid of Mr. Grayson. He told me once that Mr. Grayson had smiled at him in a way that made him feel sick. George started having nightmares. On April 14, 1885, George fell from the 3rd-floor window of our nursery. I was in the room with him. We were playing. George went to close the window because a storm was coming. I remember he was standing there, reaching up to pull it down, when suddenly he just fell forward. It was as if something startled him, but there was no one else there, just me across the room. The doctor said it was an accident. The window was old, the sill might have been slippery. But I saw George's face in that moment before he fell. He looked terrified, and he was looking at something outside. After George died, Mr. Grayson came to the funeral. He stood at the back of the church, and when we walked past him, he smiled. Not a sympathetic smile, but something else, something that made my skin crawl. My father saw it too. I heard him tell my mother later, "He did this. Somehow, he's responsible." But there was no proof. How could there be? The police said it was an accident. Then the whispers started. Anonymous letters suggesting our parents had been negligent. Rumors that father had been drinking, that mother had been inattentive. Our friends stopped visiting. People would cross the street to avoid us. Father believed Mr. Grayson was behind it all, that he was systematically destroying our family's reputation as revenge. Mother became convinced that Mr. Grayson had somehow caused George's death, though she couldn't explain how. That's when Father carved the marks into the walls, the old symbols that his grandmother from Ireland had taught him. He said they were for protection, to ward off evil intent. Mother thought he'd lost his mind, but she was so frightened that she allowed it. We had our family portrait taken in September 1887. Father insisted on it. He said we needed to show we were still a family, still strong. But I remember how frightened William was that day. Daniel turned the page, but the entry ended there. Eleanor never mentioned the Hartwells or Grayson again in the journal. Daniel spent the next week digging into Nathaniel Grayson's history, and what he found was deeply disturbing. Grayson had left a trail of ruined lives behind him throughout his business career. In 1878, before moving to Charleston, Grayson had lived in Savannah. Daniel found newspaper articles about a scandal involving a shipping company. A business rival named Henry Sullivan had accused Grayson of deliberately contaminating a cotton shipment, rendering it worthless and causing Sullivan's company to default on contracts. Sullivan had been financially destroyed and died by suicide 6 months later. Grayson had never been charged. There was no evidence linking him directly. After moving to Charleston in 1880, similar patterns emerged. In 1882, a man named Robert Pritchard had accused Grayson of fraud in a timber deal. The case was dismissed, but 6 months later, Pritchard's warehouse burned down under suspicious circumstances. Pritchard lost everything and left Charleston. In 1884, a lawyer named Martin Webb had represented someone suing Grayson. The case was dropped suddenly when Webb withdrew, citing personal reasons. Daniel found Webb's obituary from 1886. He died of a heart attack at age 42. The obituary mentioned that Webb had suffered from severe anxiety in his final years. The pattern was clear. Anyone who opposed Grayson suffered consequences: financial ruin, mysterious accidents, or sudden reversals of fortune. But there was never direct evidence linking Grayson to these events. He was always distant from the actual harm, protected by deniability. Edmund Hartwell had testified against Grayson in March 1885. 1 month later, his son was dead. Daniel found records showing that the Hartwell family's social standing never recovered. Edmund's business declined steadily after 1885. By 1890, he'd sold his Meeting Street house and moved to a more modest property. He died in 1894 at age 49. The death certificate listed heart failure. But Daniel suspected the years of stress had taken their toll. Catherine Hartwell lived until 1903, spending her final years as a boarding house keeper, a far cry from her earlier status. The daughters all married and moved away from Charleston. William left as soon as he was old enough, settling in Atlanta. None of the surviving Hartwell children ever returned to Charleston to live. Nathaniel Grayson continued his business in Charleston until 1892, when he moved to New Orleans. There, his pattern continued. More business disputes, more rivals who suffered mysterious misfortunes. Grayson died in 1909 at age 67, wealthy and successful. His obituary called him a prominent businessman and pillar of the New Orleans commercial community. There was no mention of the lives he'd destroyed. Daniel understood now why the Hartwell family had carved protective symbols into their walls. They'd been fighting an enemy who operated through intimidation and plausibly deniable harm, an enemy they couldn't touch through legal means. Daniel contacted Dr. Rebecca Thornton again, sharing everything he'd learned about the Hartwell family and Nathaniel Grayson. He sent her high-resolution images of the witch mark, along with the full context. Rebecca called him the next day, her voice excited. "Daniel, this is remarkable. I've been researching the specific configuration of that mark, and it's not just a general protection symbol. It's highly specific, designed to protect against a known human threat, not supernatural forces." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. The symbol combines several different traditions, Rebecca explained. The hexafoil base is classic European apotropaic design, but the additional elements, the way the lines intersect, the directional orientation, those are Irish folk magic traditions, specifically used for protection against the evil eye or malicious intent from a known enemy. Edmund Hartwell's family was from Ireland, Daniel said, remembering Eleanor's journal. Exactly. And here's what's really interesting: the orientation of the mark. In Irish tradition, protective symbols were often oriented toward the direction of the threat. If you carved a symbol to protect against a specific neighbor, you'd position it on the wall facing their house. Daniel felt a chill. Can you tell which direction it's facing? I enhanced the image and examined the room's layout based on the window placement and furniture arrangement, Rebecca said. The mark is carved on the north wall of that parlor. I checked historic maps of Charleston. The Grayson house was directly north of the Hartwell property. Daniel leaned back in his chair, absorbing this. The Hartwells hadn't just carved a general protection symbol. They'd carved it specifically to protect their youngest child from the direction of Nathaniel Grayson's house. There's something else, Rebecca continued. I consulted with a colleague who specializes in Irish folk traditions. In some communities, when a family believed someone had used malicious intent, what they called overlooking, to harm their children, they would perform a ritual. They'd carve the protective mark while speaking the enemy's name, binding the symbol specifically to defend against that person. So this mark was Edmund Hartwell's way of fighting back, Daniel said slowly. When he couldn't prove Grayson's involvement legally, couldn't protect his family through normal means, he turned to the old traditions his grandmother had taught him. Yes, and by carving that mark, Edmund was taking back some sense of control. He felt powerless. His son was dead, his family was being destroyed, and the legal system couldn't help him. The protective mark was his way of saying, I'm still protecting my children. Daniel thought about the photograph, about young William's fearful face, about the witch mark partially visible behind him. They included it in their family portrait. They could have positioned everyone differently, hidden it completely, but they didn't. On some level, maybe they wanted it documented, wanted someone, someday, to see it and understand. Daniel spent the following days organizing his research into a coherent narrative. He prepared a detailed report documenting the Hartwell family's story, supporting each element with primary source evidence, newspaper articles, court records, Eleanor's journal, property records, and the photograph itself. He also discovered one final piece of information. In the Charleston News and Courier from November 1887, just 2 months after the Hartwell family photograph was taken, he found a small notice. Mr. Edmund Hartwell has announced the closure of his import business on East Bay Street due to declining health and changing commercial conditions. Mr. Hartwell expressed gratitude to his customers and indicated he will be pursuing other opportunities outside of Charleston. By early 1888, Daniel found the Hartwell family had moved to Columbia, South Carolina, nearly 100 miles away. They'd left behind their home, their social circle, everything they'd built. They'd left because Nathaniel Grayson had made it impossible for them to stay. Daniel contacted Patricia Morrison, Eleanor Hartwell's granddaughter, whom he'd located through genealogical records. Patricia was 73 and lived in Virginia. When Daniel called and explained his research, there was a long silence. My grandmother never spoke about her childhood in Charleston, Patricia finally said. She had siblings who died young, that much I knew, but she never told us the details. She always said there were painful memories she preferred not to revisit. I have her journal, Daniel said gently. She wrote about what happened. Would you like to read it? Patricia came to Charleston 2 weeks later. Daniel showed her everything. The photograph with its visible witch mark, Eleanor's journal, the documentation of Grayson's pattern of vengeance, and the evidence of how the Hartwell family had been destroyed. Patricia sat quietly for a long time, looking at the photograph of her grandmother as an 8-year-old girl. I need to tell you something, Patricia finally said. My mother, Eleanor's daughter, died when I was young. But before she passed, she told me a story. She said her mother had made her promise something unusual. Eleanor had said, never speak ill of anyone, never seek revenge, never try to hurt someone even if they've hurt you. That path leads only to darkness and destroys everyone it touches. Patricia touched the photograph gently. I always wondered why my grandmother felt so strongly about that. Now I understand. She'd seen what happens when someone chooses vengeance over humanity. "Your grandmother survived," Daniel said. "She built a life, had children and grandchildren. The Hartwell family may have lost their social standing and wealth, but they kept their integrity." Patricia nodded, tears in her eyes. She didn't let bitterness consume her. Daniel had one more question. "Do you know what happened to William?" Patricia smiled sadly. "William was my great-uncle. He became a teacher in Atlanta, spent his whole career working with underprivileged children. My mother said he always told his students, 'What happens to you doesn't have to define you.' He carried that fear his whole life," Daniel said, "but he turned it into compassion. That's the Hartwell legacy," Patricia said quietly. 3 months later, Daniel stood in the newly renovated exhibition space of the Charleston Historical Archives. The exhibit he'd curated, titled "Hidden Stories, Family Fear, and Survival in Victorian Charleston," had attracted significant attention from historians, journalists, and the local community. At the center was the Hartwell family photograph, displayed in its original frame but now accompanied by detailed interpretation. A high-resolution reproduction with the witch mark digitally enhanced hung beside it, allowing visitors to see clearly what had been hidden for 137 years. The wall text explained the full story: George's death, Nathaniel Grayson's pattern of vengeance, the systematic destruction of the Hartwell family's reputation, and the protective symbol they'd carved as a desperate act of defiance and defense. But Daniel had made sure the exhibit didn't end with tragedy. Additional panels told the rest: how Eleanor, Amelia, and William had all survived to live long lives, how they'd built families and careers, how they'd turned their childhood trauma into compassion for others. Patricia had loaned Eleanor's journal to the museum, and selected excerpts were displayed alongside other documents. Daniel had also included broader context: how the late 19th century was a time when old folk traditions clashed with modern rationality, when people caught between worlds sometimes turned to ancient practices when contemporary solutions failed. The exhibit examined Nathaniel Grayson's life too, documenting his pattern of using social and economic pressure to destroy those who opposed him. Daniel had found records of at least 7 families who'd suffered after crossing Grayson. On opening day, Patricia stood beside Daniel as visitors moved through the exhibit. Many people stopped for a long time in front of the family photograph, studying the faces, looking at the partially visible witch mark. "You know what strikes me most?" Patricia said. "For 137 years, this photograph sat in people's homes, and no one knew. It just looked like an ordinary Victorian family portrait. But it was actually a record of survival, of resistance, of people refusing to surrender." Daniel nodded. "Every photograph has a story. Every face represents someone who lived, suffered, loved, fought for what mattered to them." A group of students moved past. Daniel overheard one say, "They carved that symbol to protect their kids. That's actually really brave." "It worked in a way," another responded. "Their kids survived. They didn't let that Grayson guy win." Later that evening, after the reception ended, Daniel stood alone in the exhibition space, looking at the photograph one last time. Edmund and Catherine stared back with their solemn expressions, flanked by their 3 remaining children. The witch mark on the wall behind William was clearly visible in the enhanced version, oriented toward the north, toward the direction of threat. These parents had lost one child and feared losing the others. Unable to prove their enemy's guilt, unable to find justice through conventional means, they'd turned to an old tradition, carved symbols of protection, and held their family together through determination. And it had worked. Not mystically. Daniel didn't believe the witch mark had magical properties, but psychologically, it had given them strength. It had been their way of fighting back, of refusing to be helpless victims. The photograph had preserved that moment of quiet defiance for 137 years, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what it really contained. Not just images of people, but evidence of courage, resilience, and the human capacity to survive even when all conventional weapons have been taken away.